We have three speakers this evening, and they're Parrill, who's professor of cognitive science here, Parrill Brandt, who's professor of both cognitive science and modern language and literature, and Sarah Waller. And Sarah Waller is a professor of philosophy and cognitive science, and is a very unusual philosopher who actually works with whales. There aren't a lot of philosophers that work, or dolphins, pardon me. Cetaceans, let's put it that way. So we have an interesting combination here, and I've also asked Mark Turner, who is one of the founders of this department and you know, a major player in cognitive science, to make some closing remarks near the end of our discussion. But in between, there's going to be lots of room for discussion, and I encourage you, since it's the evening session, just to let loose and, you know, say whatever comes to mind, as long as it's reasonably coherent. So, without any further ado, we'll move to our first speaker, Parrill. It's all yours, Faye.
Thank you. Okay, so this talk is not going to be presenting any novel theoretical claims. It's really just designed to introduce people to some research that they might not have encountered before. Okay, so I'm going to start with, my basic point is going to be that gesture, looking at these gestures people produce when they're talking, can actually tell us something about the nature of human representation. So first of all, we notice that the word representation appears immediately in my talk. And looking at gestures gives us support for some particular theories of human representations of time, namely that these representations are spatial. And this is something that's come up already in the symposium, so hopefully we can get into it in a little more detail. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some conceptual models of time, basically give you guys some background if you're not already familiar. I'll present a couple of brief tastes of gesture and sign data. And then I'll highlight some recent work on cross-cultural variation in how these conceptual models of time are actually used. And I'm going to end by asking which of the theories described in the proposal for the symposium are really supported by the data that I'm going to be presenting. Okay, so here's a theory from cognitive science. Human beings conceptualize time in terms of space because time is an abstract concept. And this is most famously advanced by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. Okay, so we have many different conceptual models of time, but all of them are spatial. This is the claim. So for example, we can conceptualize time as a series of events. And the sort of classic timeline where events are located sort of sequentially, you know, like beads on a string, this is a spatial model of time. So when I say something like spring break is next to Easter, this is a spatial conceptualization. So, you know, here's spring break, here's Easter. They're both located relative to one another in space, just like, you know, my house is next to your house. This is spatial. We can also add motion to these kinds of models, something that Jana mentioned. So when we say Easter follows spring break, now we're adding motion to this spatial model. So if you know, this is one event and this is the next, and they're moving in this progression, one can follow the other, like the cat follows the dog. We can add another layer of complexity if we put an ego into these models. So if we put some kind of actual viewpoint into these conceptual spatial models, things get a little bit more complicated. So once you put an ego into one of these sequences of events, you have an inherent current moment. So usually wherever the ego is located, that's now. And this means that past is located relative to the ego and future is located relative to the ego. So that was a static egocentric model. These models can also involve motion. So you can add yet another layer of complexity by putting some motion into these models. There are a couple of different variants of these egocentric models involving motion. So for example, events can move. So here's a graphic representation. If we conceptualize time passing, I'm gonna wait for the siren. Yeah, sirens passing. We can conceptualize time passing as the motion of objects. So in this model, the ego is not moving, and events are moving towards the ego or away from the ego. So if you say something like the end of the year is coming or spring break is coming, it's conceptualized as moving towards you. But the ego can also move. So in this kind of model, the passage of time is motion over a landscape. So the ego is moving forward towards an event, like we're coming to the end of the year. So when people have discussed this literature and these linguistic examples, a common criticism is these are just conventional linguistic ways of talking about time. It doesn't mean anything about the way that we conceptualize events or time. Languages have various ways of conceptualizing, conventionalizing things that don't necessarily tell you about how a speaker is thinking when he or she is constructing some speech. But when you look at the gestures that people are producing as they're using these linguistic expressions, you have this extra source of information about people's conceptual structures. And these gestures are inherently spatial. So there's an enormous body of research on gesture. I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm just going to talk specifically about gestures related to time. When people are using these expressions or talking about time, they tend to gesture along two different axes. So they tend to gesture either on this sagittal plane, this way, or on the transverse plane, so this way. And when we use this transverse plane, typically current events are right about here. This is the past, and this is the future. And when we use the sagittal plane, the ego is always going to be the current moment, and that makes this the future, and this is the past. So it's basically taking that diagram I showed you earlier and sort of orienting your body in that diagram. And I'm going to focus mainly on the sagittal axis. So I'm going to show you an example of somebody speaking and gesturing. She's talking about her physics professor, and he has this particular habit of asking them to do homework, working on particular concepts, and then giving a lecture about it later. So they're doing the homework, and they're reading, and then he gives the lecture. And so she's going to talk about this. She says he lectures a couple of weeks ahead of the homework. You'll see her do this. He lectures a couple of weeks ahead of the homework.
The only problem is that he lectures a couple weeks ahead of the homework. So here you are reading and we're...
Say that again.
The only problem is that he lectures a couple weeks ahead of the homework. So here you are reading and we're...
What's that? So if we just looked at her speech, we would think, okay, she's talking about this situation in spatial terms, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's thinking about it in spatial terms. But when we look at her gesture, we see she's actually laying out a spatial model that looks something like this. So if you imagine the ego being here, and this diagram sort of superimposed in this space in front of her body. So she's saying, this space here, from here to here, is, this space here is when I'm working on the homework. And here's when I get the lecture that actually explains those critical concepts. Okay, so he's lecturing a couple weeks ahead of when of the homework. And this is obviously a very spatial model. I'll say just a few words about sign languages. So sign languages have actually grammaticalized this sagittal axis. Sign languages use the transverse axis as well, but this one has grammatical purposes. And essentially, it's the same as, it's used in the same way that you see gestures use it. So where the body is the current moment, this is the future, and this is the past. So I'm going to show you the lexical sign for before. So this is basically the near past is at the shoulder, and this is before. This is the word for before in American Sign Language. Okay, so this conceptualization where your body is the current moment and this is the future and this is the past, this is really robust across many, many languages. Indo-European, non-Indo-European, you find it in many languages. But I wanted to talk also about a recent exception. And this is a paper published in Cognitive Science in 2006 by Nunez and Sweetser. And they talk about this language, Aymara, which is a language spoken in Peru, Bolivia, Chile, in which the future is conceptualized as being behind the ego, and the past is in front of the ego. So first of all, you find a variety of linguistic expressions in Aymara in which words meaning things like behind have to do with the future, words meaning talking about the front have to do with the past. So these are linguistic expressions. Like, for example, kipa marana, the literal translation in Aymara is behind year, so you'd think, okay, that's the past. But the English equivalent means in the year to come, so 2008. So just to represent this graphically, here's the English model. The current moment is where the ego is, and the future is ahead, the past is behind. The Aymara model is exactly the same, except that future and past are reversed. So I'm going to show you an example. And the important thing to remember is that the speaker is talking about the future, but you see him point behind his body. So he's going to say, akamarata mararu, meaning from this year to next year. And you'll see when he says akamarata, he'll point to this space generally, meaning this year. And he'll point behind his body when he says mararu. So if you don't follow the speech and gesture exactly, just keep in mind he's pointing like this and he's talking about the future. This is the person to watch.
Akamarat mararu. Sí, akamarat mararu marai.
Let me show you that one more time.
Akamarat mararu. Sí, akamarat mararu marai.
Okay, so just to recap. When we look at linguistic expressions, we look at gesture, and we look at the grammatical structure of sign languages, we see some evidence for spatial conceptualizations of time. So I'm hoping that one of the things we can talk about is which of the theories described in this proposal is or are supported by these data. And just to kind of recap quickly in case these have sort of faded from your memory, the sensory present model essentially can be described as claiming that conceptualizations of time are constrained by neuroanatomical facts, by cycles of neural circuits, for example. The episodic memory model we've talked about a fair amount. The notion being we have sort of an autobiographical construction of time in memory. And then the cultural model arguing that your cultural viewpoint is going to heavily influence your conceptualizations of time. And I have some thoughts on which of these models are supported, but I'm going to leave it open. So I'll just show you these references in case anyone wants to jot these down, and end there.
You don't have to answer now, but may I have your keynote or PowerPoint?
I think I'm just going to post it on the website where this symposium is described.
Which will be tv.kstudy. By the way, this is all going to be on TV, http://tv.kstudy.edu to the world. I was going to say I wouldn't distribute it, but if you want to distribute it.
I have permission from the people that the clips belong to, so.
Yeah, and I will send you my contribution.
All right.
This actually, I'm prefacing this as a devil's advocate crazy question, or crazy scenario, or possible crazy scenario. What if the gesturing to the back isn't, in fact, what if it's a perspective issue? In other words, the gesture is for not the speaker,
but the addressee
interlocutor who is facing the speaker, and therefore the future as is indeed in front of the speaker, and not in back of, in front of the interlocutor and not in back of the speaker. So what is the evidence that that is not true.
So I guess maybe Thais would like to answer.
No, can I say something?
Absolutely.
I think the reason why the past is in front is because you can see the past. The future you cannot see, so it's behind you. You cannot see it. You cannot predict it, and that's the reason.
That's
Be ready for everybody.
That's exactly
No,
what's
but for them, it's that way.
But
You know, they see it that way.
Your reason is universal.
but we have to let Faye get her 2 cents in here.
So this is exactly the explanation that the authors of this paper propose, and this is a language that uses evidential markers, so it's maybe more reasonable to think that they place a lot of prominence on known versus unknown. And so the question that Parrill raises, why don't all languages do this? Well, some languages, the more common choice seems to be the motion-based metaphors. But to get back to Todd's question, I guess the 2 sources of support that I would bring, one are the linguistic examples. I mean, they really do mean front and back. And the second source of evidence is simply the fact that even in sign languages where you do some perspectival shifting of the sort that you're talking about to accommodate your interlocutor, people never talk about time that way. You never gesture behind your body simply because it's further away from your interlocutor. And hearing people, we never gesture this way either. So it would be very, very marked. That's all I can say.
So mostly perspective shifts are spatial rather than temporal.
Correct.
Generally.
I didn't quite catch the
So
question.
the gloss would be most perspective shifts tend to be spatial oriented rather than time is not perspective.
Well, I mean, perspective shifts can be anything from space to person to, co-reference. It can be complicated stuff, but yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying it's really improbable, but that doesn't mean that I've, disproved it.
Ron, you had a question.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. You're using 2 binaries, left, right, which you left, and then you concentrate on front behind. So on the left, right, I noticed your student, she was using right for the future. You actually spontaneously used left. I may have been wrong when you were referring to the future, but you were referring to a written text behind you. So I'm just wondering about bilaterality and the presence. It actually links back to Todd's question, the presence of some other set of references that are visibly present to somebody, like for us, it's a text behind you.
Okay, so maybe I can come back to the text, because the first thing I want to say is the speaker uses a kind of diagonal axis. The woman who's talking about her physics professor, her axis is more or less diagonal, and it's because her interlocutor is right here, and she doesn't want that axis to be pointed directly at him. And this is something you see a lot in gesture, and it sort of has to do with Todd's question. You do shift your axes a little so as not to impinge on other people's space. But yeah, in terms of the diagram, I guess I don't quite know what to say about it. There's something really complicated going on.
Would left-handed people use right-handed gestures to indicate the future, or would they actually reverse it, and would we know?
Would left-handed people use?
Because the bilaterality is the suggestion is the future.
Mark's nodding.
Left-handed Aymarans do the same gestures as right-handed Aymarans.
Do they?
Yes. Or at least so Raphael tells me, and I wouldn't know.
There is an effective writing system, though, apparently, on.
Yes, I was going to say, what about Arabic gesturers, for example?
Yeah.
Would they gesture with time?
If they were using the transverse axis, maybe. I don't actually know of any published research on this, but it seems to strike people as intuitively correct that they would do it this way, this being the future. Sarah?
I can't actually answer the gesture question, but when I was in Anjan Chatterjee's lab at Penn, he was looking at this, do people have expectations about the future, and how do they then, where does their eye gaze go with expected action? And it looked like whether they spoke Arabic or a language that went up and down, or English, it seemed like there was an innate bias to go left to right for action. And in fact, Anjan had hypothesized that this is why in horror movies you will often see the filming go right to left, because that's creepy for us.
Yeah, I've heard about that inherent bias.
So yeah, that's Anjan.
small observation. As an artist, I'm interested in the Hindu gods with all the arms and one foot moving forward and one back, and that I always believed that all of those arms meant that you were outside of space and time, that your gestures were outside of space and time. And it's interesting to me to talk about those axes, because I always wondered why one foot was raised and moving.
And do you know if there's any symbolism associated with, I mean, I have no idea, with that raised foot? And
just the idea of you're not in any space or given space or time at the same time, that the spiritual is outside of space and time. That God's gesture, because of all of the arms moving, encompasses its gestures are outside of space and time.
That's interesting.
Just a quick comment about, again, the Aymara gesture. I mean, it would be logical if they thought of the future as something that could not be known, in some sense seen. That the point was not where it was laid, but that it was hidden.
Yes.
Therefore,
That's exactly the argument, that they... David?
Has there been any research done looking into the consequences of that, like basically just substituting instead of using like a source path goal metaphor for time, they're using, I guess, a perception oriented conceptualization, but is there any
way of demonstrating that that's really what they're using,
or like are there any effects of that on culture, on the way they interact with each other, and like meeting, like urgency of time, stuff like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't really speak to this since it's not my research, but the argument is they use this metaphor having to do with things that are known being visible and things that are unknown being invisible. So that's where the future past comes from, and that it's maybe not a product of grammatical features of their language, but certainly, strengthened by grammatical features of their language. Namely, you have to mark your information source. But I don't know whether there are any other cultural effects. Mark, do you know?
On the cultural side, connecting with the comments of Professor Benson, it's important to point out that, I mean, for one, we're captive to Sweetser and Nunez.
Yes.
They've done the work and they're telling us what it means. But it's an abiding 100% aspect of their research that somewhat younger Aymaran speakers who are fluent in Spanish gesture the way we do.
That's right.
It's only the older Aymarans who are not fluent in Spanish, according to Nunez and Sweetser. Well, I don't know if you know Aymaran, but they claim that it's only the older ones who are not fully fluent in Spanish who gesture in this unusual way that we see.
One of my aunts was married to an Aymara Indian. And he was certainly not from the very oldest generation.
Indian fluent in Spanish?
Yes, he was.
And how does this person gesture?
He gestured like this.
Okay, you need to tell me that so I can send it to Eve and Raphael.
Yeah.
That's how science works.
It's very interesting. One of the implications of all this to me, if I were to draw a deep theoretical conclusion from Parrill's presentation, is that language has such influence as to set the parameters of nonverbal time representation. And even to reverse those parameters. What does that say to us in terms of our theories about the relative setting of those parameters? In other words, that's something that I think we should all think about. It's a very interesting insight.
Yeah, and I guess one of the important questions is whether these representations are, I guess, restricted to the kind of thinking you do when you're formulating speech or you're formulating communicative information.
Yes, well,
I'm trying to get off of here.
Well, thank you very much for a very fine presentation.